welcome to the How Do I Knit That podcast. I'm your host, Sarah Dawn of Sarah Dawn's Designs, and this 13th episode of the How Do I Knit That podcast is all about alternatives to the knitting and crochet site Ravelry. So, broadly, what is this podcast all about? Well, this podcast came about because I hear so many people saying, "Oh, I could never knit that. I could never make that." And I think that's really sad. I'm a firm believer in the idea that anyone can knit or crochet or quilt or whatever your chosen art is. All it takes is some knowledge, the right tools, the right techniques, and the willingness to get a little ingenious. If you're looking for the previous podcast episodes, you can find them on my Patreon, which I will link to in the description, or in a YouTube playlist, which I will also link to in the description. Well, let's start with the question, why do we need an alternative to Ravelry? Well, if you remember episode 11, I talked about how Ravelry was a seizure risk. Unfortunately, over a year later, it's still a seizure risk. While there have been a few minor updates, the major seizure/migraine triggers have not been amended, and the attitude of the Ravelry staff is clearly to ignore the problem and hope it goes away. In addition, Ravelry staff have made it clear that they care more about money and propriety than they do about the livelihood of the designers who, in many cases, are unable to use their site. They've shown they are unwilling to accommodate utterly reasonable requests, and the ableism continues in their social media sites and other places. Discussions of accessibility are banned and blocked on the Ravelry forums, and Ravelry's social media feeds are incredibly heavily curated, so it's only to leave positive comments up. For those who've noticed, this is why you can't comment on official Ravelry Twitter posts. It's also become clear that those who are advocating for accessibility and true inclusion are going to be targets of harassment. Designers who have not deactivated their Ravelry accounts, and for that matter those who have, are seeing their pattern pages vandalized by Ravelry staff and volunteers, with purchase and information links deleted. Given that many magazines and third-party design calls still require a Ravelry portfolio as part of their submissions process, this is not only harming the designer's immediate sales, but also hurting their ability to be accepted into other publications. So, if we, as a fiber community, want to be inclusive, we need to find alternatives to Ravelry. Plus, there are many crafters who aren't able to use Ravelry anymore, so finding alternative resources is a huge boon for the many crafters who can't rely on Ravelry for their own safety. Also, there are many designers and makers who run their businesses, in part or in full, via Ravelry, and we also need alternatives for those folks, as businesses in many jurisdictions have legal requirements to be accessible for people with disabilities. That leaves us, the crafting and fiber community, to find alternative resources to the Ravelry functionality. And before I delve into a wonderful list of resources, I want to remind folks, I intend to talk about all sorts of knitting, crocheting, and crafting stuff so that you can create amazing things in whatever situation you're in. Remember, you can, in fact, knit that. And when I say knit that, I also mean crochet that or spin that. It applies to pretty much any craft I can think of. And for those things to talk about, I'll be relying on you, my listeners and audience. I want to hear what keeps you from knitting or crocheting, and I'll try and address the barriers you mentioned. It can be anything at all. I'll at least try and give you some advice. If you have trouble with a particular technique, are wondering how to knit with limited or no time, or can't find tools that work for you, please reach out and I'll try and address your concern on the podcast. I'll even do pattern support, provided the pattern is free online and accessible to me, or one I can find at my local library. And of course, I'm able to answer questions about my own designs as well. You can submit your question by email and have them be read on the show, or you can submit an MP3 voice recording, and I'll play it on the podcast. So with that reminder, let's keep going and talk about some wonderful alternatives to Ravelry. The first thing that comes to mind is the up-and-coming Fiber Club. Designed as an alternative to the monopoly that is Ravelry, they're being built from the ground up with inclusivity in mind. Sadly, they're not live yet at the time of this recording, but from what I've been seeing and hearing, I'm very hopeful. You can sign up for email updates on their website, and when they launch, I've already sent off my freebie patterns, so those will be hosted there as well. Okay, but barring a full replacement of Ravelry, what other options do we have? Well, let's start with patterns. Where can people find or sell patterns? Well, many designers actually sell via their own websites. So if you've got a favorite designer on Ravelry, see if they have their own website. You should be able to Google the name, and their website, if they have it, should be near the top of the search results. Other options? Etsy, Payhip, Lovecrafts, and maybe Patreon and Knitpicks. Etsy is probably the best known of the three, with Lovecrafts coming in a close second in the yarn and fiber world. People know Patreon, but it's not as common in the fiber world, and Payhip is a relative newcomer. Knitpicks does publish some independent patterns through their IDP program, but not all patterns are eligible. More on that later. Let's start with Etsy. As a buyer, Etsy is a pretty solid platform. The only downside is a lack of any kind of library system. If a pattern designer updates their pattern, you won't be notified, and if you want to download your pattern again, you have to go find it in your Etsy purchases, though Etsy's search option in your past purchases is actually quite good, I find. And if you want to find a particular style, or a pattern that uses a particular yarn weight, Etsy's search is pretty solid, though it's not filterable like Ravelry, so you'll have to use your search terms in your search query. In addition, you can only have up to 5 files uploaded, which means that if you have a pattern with multiple versions, pattern translations, separate chart downloads, etc., you might hit that limit. Also, Etsy SEO as a seller is, honestly, not. So many people sell on Etsy that it's very, very challenging to get your listing seen on Etsy search alone. You'll have far better luck driving people to your patterns with your own social media. Next up, Payhip. They're another platform that handles VAT and some taxes for you. Tangent, they don't do Canadian taxes yet. I'm hopeful they will soon. They're cheaper than Etsy, but still more expensive than Ravelry. They recently did a wonderful update where you have a lot more ability to customize your shop, and they do have an option to handle pattern updates for buyers. Also, you can upload as many files as you like, which is also wonderful. Downside? They're not nearly as searchable as Etsy or Ravelry. On Payhip, you already have to know the designer you want. There's no way to search for example, lace weight shawls using X amount of yardage, like you can on Ravelry, or Etsy sort of. While Payhip listings are indexed by Google search, they won't show up nearly as well as Etsy listings due to the way Etsy and Google work. As a seller, I love that Payhip has a Buy Now button that you can embed right into a website or blog post. They also have a lot more marketing options than Etsy when it comes to coupons, affiliate links, shared links, and more. Lovecrafts. Now, full disclosure, I don't sell on Lovecrafts, so this is just what I've heard from other folks. If you do sell or buy patterns on Lovecrafts and have thoughts, or I've gotten something wrong, let me know in the comments. First, a quick sleuthing on their website shows they do handle sales tax for some jurisdictions, which is great. It looks like it's very similar to Ravelry, in that you upload a pattern, add the relevant description, and publish it. I don't know how their fees compare, but from what I've heard, they are relatively similar to Ravelry's fee structure. The Lovecraft database is, while not as detailed as Ravelry's filtered, nicely searchable, which makes it a good option for the I want a lace weight shawl style searches. And it has the option to filter by language, which makes my Welsh learning self quite happy. Downside is, it's only patterns available on Lovecrafts. Unlike Ravelry's database function, which has patterns from many other sources in a wiki-style database, Lovecraft's database only searches the patterns that are available on Lovecrafts. Honestly, researching this for the podcast has made me wonder about putting my patterns up on Lovecrafts as well. Something to look at once things are a little less busy. They're one of my sources for yarn and supplies, so apparently it's all done through the same channel. Definitely something to look into. The last 2 spots for patterns are Patreon and Knitpicks/WeCrochet, but there's some special circumstances around both of those that means they wouldn't be my immediate go-to to replace Ravelry. Patreon, for those who don't know, is a membership community, so you pledge a monthly amount set by the designer and they offer things in return. And many knit/crochet designers on Patreon do offer patterns. Some are Patreon exclusives, while others may just be more in the style of a monthly fee to access all or part of that designer's pattern library. Just be aware that the pattern may be on Ravelry, as Ravelry does offer a Patreon integration. I was using this system before having to sever things from Ravelry. The biggest thing on Patreon is that the system is designed by the designer. They decide what they want to offer patrons, and so some may not offer patterns, while others may only offer some patterns, and so on. It's also not really searchable at all. But if you have a favorite designer who you really want to support, checking out what they offer on Patreon is definitely a good option to go with. Finally, there's KnitPicks/WeCrochet. First, for those who didn't know, KnitPicks and WeCrochet are sister companies under one brand, just one does knitting and one does crochet. Many of their yarns are identical, though some are different, and patterns are available for both knitting and crochet through the Independent Designers Program. The first thing to know about the Independent Designers Program, or IDP, is that it's application-based. A designer has to submit the design, and the designs are curated, so you won't see all the designs from a specific designer. That said, the search functionality for independent designers on KnitPicks is actually really good. You can filter it by yarn weight, yardage, fiber, and more. Of course, all the patterns are in KnitPicks/WeCrochet yarn. Of course, you can substitute whatever yarn you think will work, but that's something else to be aware of. Like Lovecrafts, though, the search is only available for patterns on KnitPicks/WeCrochet. Speaking as a seller, I will say that, on the one hand, the reach of KnitPicks and WeCrochet is much better than my own reach on Etsy/Ravelry/Payhip. On the other hand, the payments are a royalty system, so the designer gets less of the purchase price. But the advantage of it being a royalty is that it bypasses the mess that is sales tax. The other downside is that they only have space for one PDF. So if you want to do additional downloads, translations, etc., you have to get inventive about how to do it. For example, I tell folks that if they want the large print accessible versions of my patterns, those aren't available on KnitPicks/WeCrochet. I'm hoping that's something that changes because the ability to have multiple files in a pattern download is so helpful. But the nice thing about KnitPicks/WeCrochet is that they have the yarn immediately available. So if you want to work something in the same yarn and color as the sample, then KnitPicks and WeCrochet make that super easy. So those are most of the spaces I'm aware of that designers are selling patterns on. If I've missed one, please let me know. Next up is yarn. The Ravelry Yarn database is an amazing crowdsourced resource, and I've heard several people ask, well, what is there to replace it? YarnSub. It's a yarn database that allows you to search oodles and oodles of yarn brands and get info, comparison, purchase links, and more. While it started as a tool to help with yarn substitutions, it's also a great database of yarn. I found that some really small indie yarns sometimes don't make it into the database, but other than that, I've always found the yarn I want in the database. And honestly, it gives more info than the Ravelry Yarn database pages ever could. It also looks at things like ply, color type, woolen versus worsted spun, and other data that Ravelry didn't always pull. So it's definitely worth looking into, especially if you're looking to substitute the recommended yarn from a pattern. Just punch the original yarn into YarnSub, look for the alternatives, and get purchase links for things like KnitPicks and Lovecrafts. And if you don't get purchase links, punch the yarn you want into Google and see what comes up. Well, I found that it can have gaps in the database for rarer yarns or very small indie brands of yarn. For the most part, it comes up just fine. I've only ever had 2 yarn brands that YarnSub has failed me on. One is an imported Italian yarn, and one is a now out of business indie dyer. Otherwise, YarnSub is absolutely fantastic, suggesting possible substitutions for discontinued or hard to find yarns. The only function it lacks is that you won't see projects with the yarn knit up like you would on Ravelry, which is occasionally something I miss when I'm looking at wildly variegated or textured yarn. I want to see what it will look like after it's been knit or crocheted. But for that, I can take the yarn name, punch it into Google, and a Google image search usually answers that question. Another great resource for yarn that isn't a dedicated yarn company, KnitPicks, Lion Brand, Red Heart, etc., is Etsy. Hunting around Etsy with an Etsy search will usually get you lots and lots of yarn that's similar to your search. Not only will you have many indie dyers, but you'll also have the storefronts of many craft stores worldwide. So even commercial yarns are relatively easy to find on Etsy. Lovecrafts is very similar. It's a huge online yarn shop that features many different commercial and smaller scale dyers, and it's got a decent filtering system as well. You can select color, yarn weight, and fiber content, and then scroll through what's on sale. If you're looking for something a bit more indie, you're better off on Etsy, but Lovecrafts is definitely solid as well. In addition, you also have the online shop fronts of many local yarn stores, many of which will ship the yarn right to you. So, if you know the yarn you want from YarnSub, try a Google search. Many yarn shops will be happy to ship it to you. Some don't do international shipping, but I've learned that many will. It's definitely worth a look. And finally, if it's safe to do so, there's always the option of heading into your local yarn shop. If you've got a pattern in mind, nothing beats being able to actually go in, feel the yarn, get an idea to how it's constructed, and see the colors in person, and not over a computer screen. Just please, if you're going to do this in 2022, be safe about it, wear your mask, social distance as much as possible, and be sure to wash your hands. And with that important reminder and generally useful advice for 2022, I think that just about wraps up the podcast. A huge thanks to my patrons who supported this podcast. You folks can submit an MP3 audio or MP4 video file of your questions for the podcast over on Patreon. The podcast archive is available at my Patreon page, which is patreon.com/SarahDawnsDesigns, and future episodes will be available here on YouTube as well. Patrons usually get access the second Wednesday of every other month, and the podcast is available to the public a week after that, so the third Wednesday of every other month. Well, that's it for episode 13. Stay tuned in May 2022 for the next episode, and thank you once again for listening. I hope you enjoyed. And remember, you can in fact knit that. Happy crafting!